A soldier's homecoming. The southern sky was painted in streaks of amber and crimson as Sergeant Darius Cole drove his weathered truck down the familiar streets of Atlanta's west side. 12 grueling months in the arid deserts of the Middle East had come to an end, and he was finally home. The city had changed in subtle ways. The bakery on the corner had been replaced by a boutique, and a row of new streetlights now lined the boulevard. Yet for Darius, the heart of the place remained the same. It was where he had grown up, where his roots ran deep, and where his family waited for him. The truck's tires crunched against the gravel driveway as Darius pulled into the small bungalow he shared with his wife, Tasha, and their 7-year-old son, Malik. The house was modest but warm, its blue shutters framing a porch where Tasha often sat with a book while Malik played with his action figures. He could already hear Malik's laughter in his mind and feel Tasha's embrace. He had dreamed of this moment every night, imagining their faces as they saw him standing in the doorway. But tonight, something was off. Across the street, a police cruiser idled, its engine rumbling softly in the evening air. The red and blue lights weren't flashing, but their presence alone was unsettling. A lone officer leaned against the hood of the car, arms crossed and eyes fixed on Darius. His sunglasses glinted under the fading sunlight, masking his expression, but not the tension in his posture. Darius's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His heart pounded against his ribcage, and a knot formed in his stomach. It wasn't the first time he had seen an officer in the neighborhood, but this felt different. The officer's attention was locked on him like a spotlight. Maybe it was nothing, Darius thought. Maybe the officer was waiting for someone else. After all, he had done nothing wrong. He was just a man coming home to his family. Shaking off the unease, Darius stepped out of the truck and grabbed his duffel bag. His army uniform was still crisp, the insignias on his chest reflecting the last rays of sunlight. He took a deep breath, willing himself to focus on the moment he had been waiting for. Home. As he walked toward the house, the officer pushed off the hood of the cruiser and began crossing the street. His boots crunched against the pavement, each step deliberate and unhurried. Darius paused near the porch steps, his instincts on high alert. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Darius turned slowly, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Yes, officer. Can I help you?" The officer stopped a few feet away, his hand resting near the holster on his belt. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone cold and devoid of familiarity. Darius blinked, taken aback. "I live here," he said, gesturing toward the house. "I just got back from deployment. This is my home." The officer's gaze swept over Darius, lingering on his uniform for a moment before snapping back to his face. His expression hardened, as if he had decided not to believe him. "You got ID to prove that?" the officer asked, his fingers twitching near the gun on his hip. A wave of indignation surged through Darius. He had faced enemy fire, endured sleepless nights, and sacrificed so much for his country, only to be questioned outside his own home. He forced himself to remain calm, though every fiber of his being bristled with frustration. "Yes, I do," he replied, setting his duffel bag down. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his military ID and handed it to the officer. "Sergeant Darius Cole, U.S. Army. That's my name on the mailbox." The officer barely glanced at the ID before thrusting it back into Darius's hand. "Step away from the door," he ordered. Darius's jaw tightened. "Why?" he asked, his voice firm. "Because I said so," the officer snapped, his tone brooking no argument. He reached for his radio. "Suspicious mail claiming to live at this address," he said into the device. Darius felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Suspicious mail. He knew exactly what the officer meant. It wasn't about the uniform or the ID. It was about the color of his skin. He had heard stories like this before, but he had always believed that his service, his sacrifices, would shield him from such assumptions. Clearly, he had been wrong. "Officer," Darius began, his tone steady but edged with frustration, I've been serving this country overseas for the past year. I just want to go inside and see my family. Why are you treating me like this?" The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "You're not going anywhere until I verify who you are." Anger flared in Darius's chest, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. He thought of Tasha and Malik waiting inside, probably wondering why he hadn't come through the door yet. He thought of his fellow soldiers, men and women of all races who had fought alongside him, united by a common cause. This wasn't what he had fought for. "Call your supervisor," Darius said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere, but I'm not letting you harass me either." The officer's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snarled, stepping closer. Without warning, he grabbed Darius's arm and twisted it behind his back. "What the hell?" Darius exclaimed, the sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists sent a chill down his spine. "You're under arrest," the officer said coldly, dragging him toward the cruiser. "For what?" Darius demanded, his voice rising with disbelief. "What did I do?" Resisting, the officer replied curtly, shoving Darius into the back seat of the squad car. The door slammed shut, and Darius stared out at his house, his heart pounding. He could see the faint glow of the living room light through the window, where Tasha and Malik were likely sitting, unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. The humiliation and rage threatened to overwhelm him, but he clenched his fists and reminded himself to stay calm. He had faced worse odds before. He would find a way to fight this. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Darius's mind raced. This was a different kind of battle, one he hadn't been trained for, but one he couldn't afford to lose. The fight begins. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Darius's wrists as the police cruiser glided through the quiet streets. The hum of the engine was the only sound inside the car, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Darius's mind. He stared out the window, watching the familiar landmarks of his neighborhood pass by, places he had known since childhood. The basketball court where he played with friends, the church his family had attended for generations. All of it felt alien now, as if the arrest had transformed his world into something unrecognizable. The officer, whose name had read Officer Ridley, said nothing, his stern profile illuminated by the dashboard lights. Darius clenched his jaw, biting back the words he wanted to say. He knew better than to speak in anger. Instead, he focused on breathing deeply, the discipline of his military training grounding him in the moment. They arrived at the precinct a short while later. The station was brightly lit, its fluorescent glare stark and unwelcoming. Ridley pulled Darius out of the cruiser, his grip firm and unyielding, and led him inside. The desk sergeant glanced up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from disinterest to surprise as he noticed Darius's uniform. "What's this about?" the sergeant asked, his brow furrowing. "Suspicious behavior," Ridley replied curtly, steering Darius toward a holding cell. Darius met the surgeon's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Suspicious for walking toward my own house after serving this country for a year. That's all it took." The surgeon hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing as Ridley locked Darius in the cell and walked away. The clang of the metal door echoed through the small room, the sound settling like a weight on Darius's chest. Back at home, Tasha Cole stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the police cruiser disappeared down the street. Her heart pounded in her chest, disbelief and fear swirling in her mind. Inside, Malik was sitting on the living room floor, his crayons scattered around him as he worked on a welcome home poster for his dad. The sight of him, so innocent and unaware, brought tears to Tasha's eyes. She took a shaky breath and stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. Malik looked up, his face lighting up with excitement. "Is Daddy here?" Tasha forced a smile, kneeling down to hug her son. "Not yet, baby, but he'll be back soon." Malik frowned, his small hands clutching her shoulders. Why were the police here? Did they take Daddy? Her heart broke at the question, But she couldn't lie. "There was a mistake," she said softly. "Daddy didn't do anything wrong, but they took him. We'll get him back, okay?" Malik's eyes filled with worry, and he nodded, his tiny arms wrapping around her neck. "Promise." Tasha hugged him tightly. "I promise." As soon as Malik was settled in bed, Tasha grabbed her phone and started making calls. The first was to her sister, Keisha, a sharp-witted lawyer who had always been the family's go-to in a crisis. Keisha answered on the first ring. "Tasha, what's going on?" Keisha's voice was calm but urgent. "They arrested Darius," Tasha said, her voice trembling. "He just got home, Keisha. He didn't do anything wrong. They said he was suspicious." Keisha let out a sharp breath. "Okay, first, don't panic. I'll make some calls and find out where they took him. We'll get him out. Don't say anything to anyone else until I get there. Understand?" Tasha nodded, relief flooding her at Keisha's confidence. "Thank you." "We'll fix this," Keisha said firmly before hanging up. At the station, hours passed in the holding cell, the cold metal bench beneath Darius doing little to ease his growing frustration. He had fought through firefights, lost comrades, and endured unimaginable hardships overseas. But this, being treated like a criminal in his own country, was a different kind of pain. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Darius looked up to see a familiar face. Keisha, her heels clicking against the tile floor, approached with a determined expression. Behind her was a stern-looking officer with salt and pepper hair, Lieutenant Ramos, the precinct supervisor. "Sergeant Cole," Ramos said, his voice measured. "I understand there's been an incident." Keisha crossed her arms, cutting in before Darius could respond. "Incident? My brother-in-law was arrested for standing on his own property in uniform. That's not an incident, Lieutenant. That's misconduct." Ramos held up a hand, his expression grim. "Miss Cole, I assure you, we're investigating the matter thoroughly. Officer Ridley's actions are being reviewed." Keisha scoffed. "While he sits in a cell, I expect my client to be released immediately, or will be filing a formal complaint." Ramos nodded, signaling to a nearby officer to unlock the cell. Darius stood as the door swung open, his posture straight and unyielding despite the hours he had spent inside. As they walked out of the precinct, Keisha leaned in close. "This isn't over," she murmured. "We're going to make sure they pay for this." Darius nodded, his jaw tightening. "Not just for me. For anyone else this has happened to." The morning after. The next morning, Darius sat at the kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee. Tasha sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her mug. The warmth of the home they had built together felt tainted now, the memory of the night before casting a shadow over everything. Keisha arrived mid-morning, a stack of papers and a laptop in hand. She wasted no time, setting up at the dining room table and outlining their options. "We file a formal complaint first," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Then we reach out to the media. They need to see what happened to you. You're a veteran, a homeowner, and a father. This isn't just about Darius Cole. It's about systemic issues." Darius frowned. "You think going public is the right move? I don't want to put a target on my family." Keisha looked up, her expression fierce. "Staying quiet lets them win. They need to know they can't treat people like this and get away with it. You have a voice, Darius, and people will listen." Tasha placed a hand on his arm. "She's right. If we don't stand up now, when will we?" Darius took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on him. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it. But we do it smart." The first steps. That afternoon, Keisha helped Darius draft a statement, recounting the events of his arrest with clarity and restraint. She contacted a local journalist known for covering civil rights issues, and by evening, Darius's story was online. The headline read, "Veteran arrested outside his own home sparks outrage in Atlanta." The response was immediate. By the next morning, the article had been shared hundreds of times, and messages of support flooded Darius's inbox. Veterans organizations reached out, offering assistance. Community leaders called for meetings to discuss police accountability. Even Malik's teachers sent a note, expressing solidarity. As Darius scrolled through the messages, a sense of purpose began to take root. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a chance to make a difference. He glanced at Tasha, who was helping Malik with his homework at the kitchen table. She looked up and smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. Darius nodded, determination hardening his resolve. For us. For everyone. The power of community. The sunlight poured into the living room as Darius sat on the couch, the quiet hum of activity filling the house. Tasha was in the kitchen, organizing paperwork, while Malik played on the floor with his action figures. It was the kind of ordinary scene Darius had longed for during his deployment, but now it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a reminder that the tranquility of their home had been shattered. The article about Darius's arrest had gone viral overnight, spreading like wildfire through social media. By mid-morning, the phone hadn't stopped ringing. Friends, family, and strangers alike were reaching out with messages of support and outrage. Darius had expected some attention, but the sheer volume of it was overwhelming. Keisha, ever the strategist, arrived with more updates and ideas. She carried a tablet in one hand and a folder in the other, her expression a mix of determination and urgency. "We've got traction," she said, setting her things down on the dining table. "The story's gaining national attention. I just got off the phone with a producer from a major news network. They want to interview you." Darius frowned. National attention. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that, Keisha. This isn't just about me. What about Tasha and Malik? What if this puts a target on them?" Keisha softened, taking the seat across from him. "I get it, Darius. I really do. But the fact that this isn't just about you is exactly why you need to do it. People are listening, and if you use your voice, you can spark real change. Think about the impact you could have, not just for your family, but for everyone." Tasha walked over and placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "We're in this together," she said, "no matter what happens." Darius looked at her, then at Malik, who was now holding up one of his action figures as if it were a superhero. His son's innocent faith in the world struck a chord in him. If he could make a difference, even in a small way, it would be worth it. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." The first rally. A week later, Darius found himself standing in the middle of the town square, surrounded by a crowd of over 200 people. Keisha had worked tirelessly with local activists to organize the event, turning the public outrage into action. People from all walks of life had gathered: neighbors, veterans, students, and community leaders. Some carried signs with slogans like "Justice for Darius" and "End Racial Profiling Now," while others simply stood in silent solidarity. Darius felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as he stepped up to the makeshift podium. Public speaking wasn't his forte, but Keisha had coached him well, reminding him to speak from the heart. He gripped the edges of the podium and took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his chest. "A week ago, I came home after a year of serving overseas, hoping to hug my wife and son and find some peace. Instead, I found myself in handcuffs outside my own house, accused of being suspicious just for walking toward my front door." The crowd murmured, their expressions a mix of anger and empathy. "I'm not here to tell you my story for sympathy," Darius continued. "I'm here because what happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a system that needs to change. And change doesn't happen on its own. It happens when people like us stand together and demand it." Applause erupted, and Darius felt a surge of energy. He spoke for another 10 minutes, sharing his experience and calling for action. By the time he stepped down, the crowd was on their feet, their cheers echoing through the square. Building momentum. In the days following the rally, the momentum only grew. Keisha worked with local activists to draft a list of demands for the police department, including mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras for all officers, and an independent review board for complaints of misconduct. The demands were presented to the city council, sparking heated debates and discussions that were covered by local media. Darius, meanwhile, became the reluctant face of the movement. Requests for interviews poured in from major networks and podcasts, and while the attention was daunting, he used every opportunity to amplify the message. Each time he spoke, he thought of Malik and the kind of world he wanted his son to grow up in. A world where he wouldn't have to fear being judged by the color of his skin. One night, as Darius prepared for a live interview, Malik climbed onto his lap, holding a drawing he had made. It was a picture of their family standing in front of their house, with a bright sun and a blue sky overhead. "What's this, buddy?" Darius asked, smiling. "It's us," Malik said proudly. "You're a hero, Daddy." Darius felt a lump in his throat as he hugged his son tightly. "Thanks, little man. But you know what? You're my hero, a new ally." Amid the whirlwind of media appearances and rallies, Darius received an unexpected call from Lieutenant Ramos, the precinct supervisor. Ramos had been quietly conducting an internal investigation into Officer Ridley's actions, and the findings were damning. Not only had Ridley violated protocol during Darius's arrest, but he also had a history of similar complaints that had been swept under the rug. "I want to meet," Ramos said over the phone. "We need to talk about how to move forward." The meeting took place at a local coffee shop, away from the public eye. Ramos, dressed in plainclothes, greeted Darius with a firm handshake and an expression of genuine remorse. "Sergeant Cole, I want to start by apologizing for what happened to you," Ramos said. "It was unacceptable, and it should never have happened." Darius nodded, his gaze steady. "Apologies are a start, but what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again?" Ramos leaned forward, his tone earnest. "We're implementing new policies, mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras, and more stringent oversight. But I want to go further. I'd like to work with you and your team to build trust between the department and the community." Darius considered the offer carefully. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and hard to rebuild. But if this was an opportunity to create real change, he couldn't ignore it. "All right," he said. "But this isn't just about optics. It's about real accountability. If we're going to do this, it has to mean something." Ramos nodded. Agreed. A glimmer of hope. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Community meetings were held, bringing residents and officers together to discuss concerns and solutions. Darius worked tirelessly alongside Keisha and other activists, using his platform to push for reform while continuing to share his story. One evening after a particularly long day, Darius sat on the porch with Tasha, watching Malik chase fireflies in the yard. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on him, but so did a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. "You've done so much," Tasha said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Darius smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I couldn't have done it without you." As the fireflies danced in the twilight, Darius felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. Together. The turning point. The morning sun peeked through the curtains of the Cole household as Darius sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. The aroma of Tasha's homemade biscuits filled the room, a comforting reminder of simpler times. But even as the warmth of home surrounded him, Darius couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility weighing heavily on his shoulders. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. What started as a personal injustice had grown into a movement that was now spreading beyond their neighborhood. Darius's face and story had become symbols of resilience and resistance against systemic injustice. His social media inboxes were flooded with messages from strangers, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, others offering support, and a few spewing hateful rhetoric that he tried to ignore. Every message was a reminder of the stakes involved. Across the table, Tasha handed him a plate with a warm biscuit and eggs. "Eat something," she said, her tone both gentle and firm. "You can't lead a movement on an empty stomach." Darius smiled at her, grateful for her strength. "Thanks, babe. I don't know how you're holding it all together." She sat down across from him, her expression softening. "I'm holding it together because you're doing something important. This isn't just about what happened to us, Darius. It's about what's happening to so many people who don't have the platform you have now." He nodded, taking a bite of the biscuit. She was right, as always. But that didn't make the pressure any less daunting. A meeting with the mayor. Later that day, Darius found himself sitting in the wood-paneled office of Mayor Rosalind Carter, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had built her reputation on being a community-oriented leader. She sat across from him, her sharp eyes scanning the folder in front of her. Keisha sat to Darius's right, her laptop open and ready to take notes. "Sergeant Cole," the mayor began, leaning back in her chair. "I've read the reports and watched the video footage from that night. Let me start by saying I'm deeply sorry for what happened to you. It was unacceptable, and it's clear we need to do better as a city." Darius inclined his head, appreciating the acknowledgement but knowing it wasn't enough. "Thank you, Mayor Carter. But an apology won't fix the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. We need real change, policies, oversight, and accountability." The mayor nodded. "I agree. That's why I've called this meeting. I want to hear directly from you and your team about what needs to happen next. Lieutenant Ramos has already sent over a list of recommendations from within the department, but I need input from the community as well." Keisha leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. "We've outlined several key demands, including independent review boards for complaints, mandatory body cameras for all officers, de-escalation and bias training, and community involvement in police hiring practices. These aren't just suggestions, they're necessities." Mayor Carter studied the list, her expression thoughtful. "These are strong proposals. Implementing them will take time and resources, but I believe we can make it happen. I'll need your help rallying community support and keeping the pressure on." Darius felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the people in power were listening. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." A growing movement. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Community meetings became larger, drawing people from neighboring cities and even out of state. Social media amplified their message, with the hashtag Justice for Darius trending nationwide. Celebrities and influencers shared the story, bringing even more attention to the cause. Darius found himself standing on stages he never imagined he'd be on, speaking to crowds that seemed to grow larger with every event. At first, public speaking had been daunting, but now it felt almost natural. He spoke from the heart, drawing on his experiences as a soldier and as a man who simply wanted to protect his family. One night, after a particularly emotional rally, Darius returned home to find a package waiting on the porch. Inside was a letter and a framed photo of a young boy in a Little League uniform. The letter read, "Dear Sergeant Cole, my name is Tamika Johnson, and I'm writing to thank you. My son, Marcus, was stopped by the police last year for walking home from practice. He was just 13 years old, but they treated him like a criminal because of the color of his skin. When he saw your story, he told me, 'Mom, maybe things will get better now.' Thank you for giving him hope." Darius held the photo in his hands, his throat tightening. This was why he couldn't stop. This was why he had to keep fighting. A hard choice. As the movement grew, so did the backlash. Online, detractors accused Darius of exaggerating his story for attention. Anonymous messages filled his inbox, some threatening violence. Tasha worried constantly about their safety, especially Malik's. One night, as they lay in bed, Tasha turned to him. "Do you ever think about walking away from all of this?" Darius sighed, staring at the ceiling. "Sometimes, but then I think about Marcus or the hundreds of people who've reached out to share their stories. If I stop now, what happens to them? Who will speak up for them? Tasha nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just don't want to lose you. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. You won't, I promise. The first victory. Months after the arrest, the city council voted to approve the first round of police reforms, including mandatory body cameras and the establishment of an independent oversight board. It was a significant win, and the news spread quickly, energizing the movement. At a press conference outside City Hall, Darius stood alongside Keisha, Mayor Carter, and Lieutenant Ramos. The crowd cheered as the mayor announced the changes, but Darius knew this was just the beginning. As the event wrapped up, a reporter approached Darius, her microphone extended. Sergeant Cole, how does it feel to see your efforts leading to real change? Darius thought for a moment before answering. It feels like a step in the right direction, but this isn't just about me or this city. It's about creating a system that works for everyone. We've made progress, but the fight isn't over. A family united. That evening, Darius sat on the porch with Tasha and Malik, watching the stars come out. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. Malik climbed onto Darius's lap, holding up a homemade medal he had made with construction paper and glitter. What's this, buddy? Darius asked, smiling. It's for you, Malik said proudly. Because you're the bravest daddy ever. Darius's heart swelled as he hugged his son. In that moment, surrounded by his family, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The fight wasn't over, but together, they were ready for whatever came next. Strength through adversity. The late autumn air was crisp as Darius walked through the neighborhood park, Malik's small hand wrapped securely in his. The leaves crunched beneath their feet, their vibrant reds and yellows a stark contrast to the heavy topics weighing on Darius's mind. The community's progress over the last few months had been monumental, but the battle was far from over. Malik stopped suddenly, pointing toward a group of kids playing on the swings. Daddy, can I go play? Darius smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Go ahead, buddy. I'll be right here. As Malik sprinted toward the playground, Darius sat on a nearby bench. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails and messages that seemed to multiply by the minute. Offers to speak at conferences, invitations to collaborate on reform initiatives, and countless stories from people who had experienced similar injustices filled his inbox. Each message was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, but it also underscored the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. His phone buzzed with a call. The name Lieutenant Ramos flashed on the screen. Sergeant Cole, Ramos said when Darius answered. I wanted to update you on the internal review. Officer Ridley has officially been terminated. Darius felt a flicker of satisfaction. That's a start. But we both know this isn't just about Ridley. The system that allowed him to operate unchecked needs to be dismantled. I agree, Ramos said, which is why I'm proposing a joint initiative between the department and the community, a task force dedicated to implementing reforms and rebuilding trust. I want you to be a part of it. Darius hesitated. He knew the offer was significant, but it also meant working closely with the very institution that had wronged him. I'll think about it, he said finally. But if I'm involved, there has to be real accountability. That's exactly what I want, Ramos replied. I'll be in touch with more details. The cost of visibility. That evening, back at home, Darius shared the news with Tasha and Keisha as they gathered around the dining table. Malik sat nearby, coloring in a superhero book, blissfully unaware of the adult conversation unfolding around him. A task force, Keisha said, raising an eyebrow. That's a big deal, Darius. If you're part of it, you'll have a seat at the table where real decisions are made. But it's also risky, Tasha interjected, her worry evident. The more involved you get, the more exposed we are. People already know who you are, and not all of them are supporters. Darius leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I know, but if I turn it down, what message does that send? That I'm only willing to fight from the outside. I want to make a difference, Tasha. For Malik, for all of us. Keisha placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You've already made a difference. This is about taking it to the next level. But it's your decision, Darius. Just know that whatever you choose, we've got your back. Darius nodded, the weight of their words sinking in. He looked over at Malik, who was now holding up a drawing of a superhero that bore a striking resemblance to Darius himself. Look, Daddy, Malik said proudly. It's you. You're saving the day. Darius chuckled, pulling Malik into his lap. Thanks, buddy. You're my hero too. A community divided. The next day, Darius attended a town hall meeting to discuss the proposed reforms. The room was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of hope and skepticism hanging in the air. As Darius took the stage to speak, he felt the weight of every eye on him. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady. This movement isn't just about what happened to me. It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and valued. Change won't happen overnight, but together, we can make it a reality. The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was on board. During the Q&A session, a man in the back stood up, his voice loud and accusatory. Why should we trust the police to fix this? They've been part of the problem for decades. How do we know this isn't just a PR stunt? Darius nodded, understanding the frustration. You're right to ask that question, he said. Trust has been broken, and rebuilding it won't be easy. But if we don't engage, if we don't demand accountability from the inside, then nothing will change. This task force isn't a solution. It's a step. And I'm committed to holding them accountable every step of the way. The man didn't look entirely convinced, but the room erupted in applause again, signaling their support for Darius's words. Threats and courage. As the movement gained traction, the backlash intensified. One morning, Darius stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper and found a threatening note taped to the front door. The words, "Stay quiet or else," were scrawled in black ink, sending a chill down his spine. Tasha found him standing on the porch, the note clenched in his hand. Her face paled when she saw it. We need to call the police, she said. Darius hesitated. And tell them what? That someone's trying to scare us into silence. That's exactly what they want. But what if it's more than a threat? She pressed, her voice shaking. What if? He pulled her into a hug, his voice firm. I won't let anything happen to us, Tasha. I promise. That night, Darius sat with Keisha and outlined a plan to increase security around the house. They installed cameras and alerted trusted neighbors to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. But the incident only strengthened Darius's resolve. Taking the leap. A week later, Darius officially joined the task force. The first meeting was held in a conference room at City Hall with a diverse group of community leaders, activists, and police officers in attendance. Lieutenant Ramos chaired the meeting, his demeanor professional yet approachable. As you all know, this task force is about more than implementing reforms, Ramos said. It's about rebuilding trust between the police and the community. And that starts here, with us. Darius listened carefully as each member introduced themselves and shared their goals for the initiative. When it was his turn, he stood, his voice steady but passionate. I'm here because I believe in accountability and justice. I'm not anti-police. I'm anti-injustice. This task force has the potential to make a real difference, but only if we commit to transparency and action. The room nodded in agreement, and for the first time, Darius felt a glimmer of hope that this initiative could lead to meaningful change. A movement solidified. As the weeks turned into months, the task force made significant progress. New policies were drafted, training programs were implemented, and community police forums were held regularly. The city began to see the first signs of change, and the movement Darius had sparked continued to grow. One evening, as Darius tucked Malik into bed, his son looked up at him with wide eyes. Did you save the day, Daddy? Darius smiled, brushing a curl from Malik's forehead. "Not yet, buddy, but we're getting closer." As he turned off the light and stepped out of the room, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but with his family, his community, and his unwavering determination, he was ready for whatever came next. Building the bridge. Bringing the community together. The following week, the task force held its first public forum, inviting residents from all corners of the city to share their concerns and ideas. The room was packed, with standing room-only attendees spilling out into the hallway. Darius sat at the front of the room alongside Lieutenant Ramos and other task force members, a palpable tension in the air. The first speaker was an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the community for over 40 years. She clutched the microphone tightly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've lived here my whole life," she said. "I've seen our neighborhood change, and not always for the better. But what scares me most is that my grandchildren are growing up in a world where they're taught to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. That has to change." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Darius nodded solemnly, his heart aching for the truth of her statement. As more people stepped forward to share their stories, both of injustice and hope, Darius felt the weight of their experiences settle on his shoulders. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, the room falling silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your stories matter. They're the reason we're here. I know what it feels like to be seen as less than, to be treated like you don't belong. But I also know the power of community, of standing together to demand change. That's what this is about." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, Darius felt the strength of their collective will. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for a future where their children and grandchildren wouldn't have to endure the same struggles. Challenges within the task force. As the task force delved deeper into its work, tensions occasionally flared. Not everyone was on the same page, and heated debates often broke out during meetings. Some officers felt the reforms were too drastic, while community members argued they didn't go far enough. One particularly contentious meeting centered around the implementation of body cameras. Officer Bailey, a veteran on the force, voiced his concerns. "Look, I get it," he said, his tone defensive. "But these cameras make it feel like we're being watched constantly. It's hard to do our jobs when we're under a microscope." Darius leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "With all due respect, Officer Bailey, that's the point. Accountability isn't about making your job harder. It's about ensuring that everyone, officer and civilian alike, is treated fairly. If you're doing the right thing, you have nothing to worry about." The room fell silent, Bailey's face reddening as he nodded begrudgingly. Lieutenant Ramos intervened, steering the conversation back on track. "The cameras aren't negotiable," he said. "They're a tool to build trust, and that's what we need right now." Despite the occasional clashes, progress was being made. Policies were drafted, training programs were developed, and pilot initiatives were launched in select precincts. The task force was becoming a model for other cities, drawing national attention. The impact at home. At home, the changes in Darius's life weren't lost on Tasha or Malik. While Tasha remained supportive, she couldn't hide her concern for his well-being. Late one night, as they lay in bed, she turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "You're doing so much good, Darius," she said. "But I worry about what it's taking out of you. You've barely had time to breathe since this started." Darius sighed, staring at the ceiling. "I know, but if I slow down, I feel like I'm letting everyone down. Our community, our family. This fight is bigger than me." Tasha reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I get that, but you can't pour from an empty cup. Promise me you'll take care of yourself too." He nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise." The next day, Darius made an effort to spend more time with Malik, taking him to the park and helping him with his homework. It was a small but meaningful step, a reminder of why he was fighting in the first place, a test of resolve. As the movement gained traction, the backlash continued to grow. One afternoon, while Darius was walking to a local cafe for a meeting, a man approached him on the sidewalk. The man's expression was tense, his voice low and hostile. "Think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" the man said, stepping closer. "Stirring up trouble, making things worse for everyone. You should have kept your mouth shut." Darius squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "I'm standing up for what's right," he said evenly. "If that makes people uncomfortable, so be it." The man muttered something under his breath before walking away, leaving Darius shaken but resolute. He knew the path he had chosen wouldn't be easy, but moments like these only strengthened his determination. The first major win. Several months into the task force's work, the City Council approved a comprehensive reform package. It included mandatory body cameras, de-escalation and bias training, and the establishment of an independent oversight board. It was a monumental step forward, and the news was met with widespread celebration. At a press conference announcing the reforms, Darius stood alongside Lieutenant Ramos, Mayor Carter, and other task force members. As the mayor detailed the changes, the crowd erupted into cheers, and Darius felt a deep sense of accomplishment. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "This is a victory for all of us," he said. "But it's not the end of the fight. Real change takes time, and it takes commitment. This is just the beginning." The crowd's applause was deafening, and as Darius stepped down from the podium, Tasha and Malik rushed to his side. Malik hugged his legs tightly, looking up at him with wide, proud eyes. "You did it, Daddy," Malik said, his voice filled with awe. Darius knelt down, wrapping his arms around his son. "We did it, buddy. Together." As the sun set over the city, Darius stood with his family, surrounded by a community that had rallied together in the face of adversity. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like real change was within reach. The legacy of change. A movement expands. Months had passed since the City Council approved the police reform package, and while the changes were still in their infancy, the community had begun to feel the effects. Patrol officers equipped with body cameras interacted more cautiously, de-escalation tactics became the norm, and the independent oversight board was up and running, fielding complaints with transparency and fairness. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Darius Cole had become a household name, not just in his city but across the country. News outlets chronicled his journey from soldier to activist, and his story had inspired similar movements in cities nationwide. Yet for Darius, the fight was far from over. Every victory felt like the beginning of a new challenge, a new opportunity to push for change. One brisk morning, Darius sat in the office of the Daniels Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit organization he had founded with the help of Keisha and other community leaders. The foundation's mission was to advocate for systemic reform, provide legal aid to victims of police misconduct, and offer resources to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Stacks of papers covered the desk in front of him, reports on ongoing cases and initiatives. Tasha, now the foundation's operations manager, walked in with a clipboard, her expression equal parts determined and tired. "You've got 2 interviews this afternoon," she said, setting the clipboard down. "And don't forget the community dinner tonight." Darius leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Sometimes I feel like we're just scratching the surface. For every win, there are a dozen more battles waiting." Tasha placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're making a difference, Darius. One step at a time." The weight of leadership. Despite the foundation's success, the pressure of being a public figure had taken its toll on Darius. The constant scrutiny, the threats, and the never-ending demands for his time and attention weighed heavily on him. He often found himself longing for the simplicity of his pre-deployment life, when his biggest worries were providing for his family and spending quality time with Malik. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Darius sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above. Malik joined him, clutching a telescope they had been working on together. "Can we look at the moon, Daddy?" Malik asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Darius smiled, grateful for the moment of normalcy. "Of course, buddy." As they adjusted the telescope and gazed at the moon's surface, Malik's innocent questions reminded Darius of why he had chosen this path. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for a better world for his son. The breaking point. As the Foundation's influence grew, so did the opposition. Online harassment escalated, and one day, a brick was thrown through the front window of the Foundation's office. The message was clear. Not everyone was happy with the changes Darius was pushing for. Keisha was the first to arrive at the scene. She stood in the shattered glass, her face grim as she called Darius. "You need to see this." When Darius arrived, his chest tightened at the sight. A crude note was attached to the brick, scrawled with the words, "Stay out of it, or else." Tasha arrived moments later, her face pale. "This has gone too far, Darius. What if they come after us at home?" "What if?" "They won't," Darius said firmly, though the fear in his voice betrayed him. "We'll install more security, inform the police, and keep going. They want us to be scared, to stop. But we can't." Tasha stared at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and worry. "You're so strong, Darius. But even you have limits." A surprising ally. Not long after the incident, Darius received an unexpected visit from Lieutenant Ramos. The seasoned officer seemed more determined than ever to ensure the reform succeeded. "I heard about the brick," Ramos said, his voice filled with concern. "That kind of intimidation is unacceptable. If there's anything I can do, anything the department can do, let me know." Darius studied Ramos, searching for any hint of insincerity. "Why do you care so much, Lieutenant? Most people would have walked away by now." Ramos sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Because I've seen what happens when we don't change. I've seen good officers leave because they couldn't stand the culture, and I've seen communities suffer because we failed them. I don't want to be part of that anymore." Darius nodded, appreciating Ramos's honesty. "Then let's keep pushing." A national spotlight. The movement reached new heights when Darius was invited to speak at a national conference on policing and justice reform. Held in Washington, D.C., the event was attended by policymakers, activists, and law enforcement leaders from across the country. Standing at the podium in a packed auditorium, Darius took a deep breath. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the arrest outside his home, the rallies, the reforms, the threats. It all came rushing back as he began to speak. "Change isn't easy," he said, his voice steady. "It's uncomfortable. It challenges us to confront the parts of ourselves and our systems that we'd rather ignore. But discomfort is where growth begins. My story isn't unique. It's one of many. And until every story of injustice becomes a story of accountability and healing, our work isn't done." The audience erupted into applause, and for the first time, Darius felt the weight of his work lift, even if just for a moment. He wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they were creating a movement that couldn't be ignored. The legacy begins. Back in Atlanta, the changes continued to take root. The Daniels Foundation expanded its reach, partnering with organizations across the country to advocate for justice and equality. The task force's reforms became a blueprint for other cities, proving that progress was possible with the right leadership and community involvement. One evening, as Darius sat with Tasha and Malik on the couch, watching a documentary about civil rights leaders, Malik turned to him with wide eyes. "Daddy, are you a hero like them?" he asked. Darius chuckled, pulling Malik close. "No, buddy. I'm just a guy trying to do what's right." Tasha smiled, resting her head on Darius's shoulder. "That's what makes you a hero." As the credits rolled and the house grew quiet, Darius looked out the window at the city he loved. The road ahead was still long, but the foundation had been laid. Together, they were building something that would last, a legacy of hope, resilience, and change. A new dawn. A community united. Months passed, and the changes sparked by Darius Cole and the Daniels Foundation began to ripple through the city and beyond. Neighborhoods that once lived in fear of the police started to see officers walking the streets not as enforcers but as allies. The police department's new oversight board, made up of equal parts community members and law enforcement, held its first public review of cases. The decisions were met with widespread approval, signaling a new era of transparency. Darius spent his days juggling responsibilities at the foundation, speaking at national events, and continuing to build bridges between law enforcement and the community. Yet, amidst all this, he made a conscious effort to prioritize his family. Evening dinners became sacred, a time to connect with Tasha and Malik, sharing moments of laughter and love that reminded him why he fought so hard. A defining moment. One crisp autumn morning, Darius stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of thousands. It was the anniversary of his arrest, the day that had changed everything. The air buzzed with anticipation as he stepped up to the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before him. Some carried signs with messages like justice in action and unity through change, while others simply stood, their eyes locked on him with hope. 2 years ago, Darius began, his voice strong and steady. I stood outside my own home in handcuffs, wondering how the country I had served could see me as a threat. That moment was one of pain and humiliation, but it was also a moment of awakening. It showed me that change doesn't happen by waiting. It happens when we demand it. He paused, letting the words sink in. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a testament to the power of community. Together, we've proven that change is possible. But this isn't just my story. It's ours. And our work is far from over. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Darius stepped back, his heart swelling with gratitude and resolve. Tasha and Malik stood at the edge of the stage, their smiles beaming with pride. He walked toward them, wrapping his arms around his family, the moment feeling like a culmination of everything they had endured and achieved. The end of a chapter. As the sun set on the city, Darius sat on the porch of their home, the air crisp and filled with the sounds of children playing in the distance. Malik sat next to him, flipping through a book about famous civil rights leaders, his eyes wide with wonder. "Daddy," Malik said, looking up from the book, "do you think I can make a difference like you someday?" Darius smiled, pulling his son close. "You already do, buddy. Every kind word, every good choice, every time you stand up for what's right. You're making a difference, and one day you'll change the world." Tasha stepped outside, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She sat on the other side of Darius, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've done so much, Darius. For us, for this city. I hope you're proud of yourself." He nodded, gazing out at the quiet street. "I am. But more than anything, I'm proud of us, what we've built together." As the evening light faded, the three of them sat together, watching the stars emerge one by one. The fight wasn't over, and Darius knew there would always be more work to do. But in that moment, surrounded by love and hope, he allowed himself to feel a profound sense of peace. The legacy lives on. In the years that followed, the Daniels Foundation grew into a national organization, helping communities across the country implement similar reforms. Darius became a sought-after speaker and mentor, sharing his story and inspiring others to stand up for justice. Malik, inspired by his father's example, grew into a compassionate and driven young man, eager to leave his own mark on the world. But for Darius, his greatest pride wasn't in the policies change or the awards received. It was in the small, quiet moments, sitting at the dinner table with his family, watching Malik grow, and knowing that they had built a life rooted in love, resilience, and the belief that change was always possible. And so, the story of Sergeant Darius Cole didn't end. It became a part of something greater, a legacy of hope and courage that would continue to inspire generations to come.